So welcome. My name is Joe Klewicki. I'm the head of the Electrical, Mechanical, and Infrastructure Engineering program or school at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be the MC tonight. I welcome you to launch the University of Melbourne's Water Security Series. This series brings together experts from academia, industry, and government to discuss significant challenges and opportunities and hopefully solutions around water security. Tonight's the inaugural event, and we're focusing on sustainable water management, the Murray-Darling, and the story behind the headlines. Before we start, can I ask each of you to switch off your mobile devices, please? And some housekeeping. In case of emergency, an evacuation alarm will sound. I guess that's a door there. And you'll be directed by the event staff to leave, I would hope, and make your way to the nearest exit. The nearest toilet is outside the theater in the foyer. Please note that this event is being filmed, and the use of the video will be put on the University of Melbourne website and shared via email and social media. Please note that any questions during the Q&A session, which will be near the end, will be on Slido and will be recorded, and that your consent has been given. I guess your consent has been given by attending? Okay. To begin with, I'm very pleased to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Boon Wurrung and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respect to their elders and families past and present. I would now like to welcome the traditional owner of the Boon Wurrung, Garin Steel, to conduct a welcome to country. Garin.
Oh, this is working. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge University of Melbourne and, of course, the organisers for tonight's event. I'd like to acknowledge the panellists for discussing a very important issue. And, but I'd like to make another acknowledgement. The other acknowledgement I'd like to make tonight is to the ancestors and the people that came before me that made it possible for me to share what I'm about to share with you. And this was because of a strong oral history and a strong determination to pass this information down from generation to generation, despite the turbulence that my people, my community have gone through over the last 180 years. 180 years ago, my great-great-grandmother, a woman named Louisa Briggs, many of you may have not have heard of her, but a lot of her history is recorded in University of Melbourne's libraries. So, you know, if you ever feel a little bit curious to read about her life story and what she went through, feel free to do that. So Louisa was born in Melbourne about 180 years ago, around about the 1830s, 1840s. We don't really know because they didn't exactly issue birth certificates back then. But we can guesstimate how old she was because one of the comments that she made when she was much older, she talked about when she was a child and the third house in Melbourne was being built. So we can sort of guesstimate that she would have been born in around mid-1830s. And sort of being born in that time in this area that we now call Melbourne was a really interesting time because, of course, in the 1840s, Melbourne pretty much exploded, the population exploded, and it became a very big city, pretty much from nothing. So she got to see a lot of change. And over this 180 years, we've seen a lot of change happen in Melbourne. But what I want to do here tonight is sort of think about the past, think about the history that we have, the culture and traditions, all the things that just sort of lie below the surface, the Indigenous history of Melbourne. And the way we can sort of introduce this is actually talking about what I'm here to do, which is the welcome to country. Or, you know, as you may know, you would have heard the words before, Wominjeka, which means welcome. It means welcome. Well, it doesn't mean welcome, but it is true that we do use this word for welcome because, you know, we don't have a word for welcome in Bunurong language or Wurundjeri Wurrung language What we do have is a word that might be kind of similar to welcome. And the words they chose were very interesting because the words they chose were Wominjeka, which is 3 words together, and it's a directive. It's someone telling you to do something. So what it literally means is come. So woman means come. Je is a directive. I'm telling you to come. And ka is a really important word that changes the whole meaning. It means purpose. So one of the traditions that was passed down, the stories that was passed down by Louisa, was that the land here was created by Bunjil. And Bunjil taught the Bunurong that it was their responsibility to welcome and host guests. But what she really meant was tell guests to come with purpose. Because the most important thing you can do when you're doing a welcome to country is really focus on that purpose. So what I might get everyone to do, just if the panelists want to join along as well, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to sort of visualize what your purpose is. Because we go through life and we don't often think why we're doing things. We just sort of, we're reactive and we just do things. Because we've got all these distractions around us, just like that mobile phone that we got told to turn off. We've got all these distractions and we end up being very reactive but not really thinking about why are we actually here tonight? Well, why is it so important? Now, purpose comes in 2 forms. We have an individual purpose and we have a shared purpose. So while we all came here for our own reasons, our own contributions, we also came here for a shared purpose. So we need to identify that as well. Now, if everyone's got their eyes closed, I'm just doing a scan of the room. Yep, okay. So we've identified our purpose and we've turned off those distractions. So I can say, Wominjeka, Murray-Darling Bunurong Namda, Baraptan, Atawillam. We can open our eyes again. So that's pretty much the welcome. And it really stems from that tradition of telling visitors to come with purpose. Because purpose tells us what people are going to do, right? So according to the traditions of my ancestors, Louisa, Deramit, Dugbayan Baruch, my mother, my grandmother, my great-great-grandfather, the land that we meet tonight was created by Bunjil. Bunjil, who travels as the eagle, and Wa, who protects the waterways and travels as the crow. Now, Bunjil taught the Bunurong to welcome guests, but he asked us to ask all guests to make 2 promises. First promise, not to harm the land or the children of Bunjil. The second promise, to obey and respect the ways of Bunjil. And of course, the first way to do that is by starting off with your purpose in mind. So, thank you again. Wominjeka, Murray-Darling Bunurong Namda, Baraptan, Atawillam. Thank you.
Thank you, Garin. That was great. Slido. As part of tonight's discussion, our panel will be answering audience questions, and I encourage the audience to engage with the panel through this app called Slido. To submit your questions, please go to www.slido.com. It should be up on the screen somewhere. Yeah, down at the bottom. And enter the event code #WaterSecurity19 and type in your questions, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag for the discussion is the same, #WaterSecurity19, or hash, I guess they say here in Australia. It's been a busy start to the year for water management and politics in the Murray-Darling Basin, and the tragic mass-scale fish deaths in the Menindee have shown a national spotlight on these issues, and so that's what I think you're all here to hear about. Tonight we have a panel of leading experts to give us their perspectives on what's really going on, and they'll discuss the important issues around the legalities of the Basin Plan, addressing rights of Indigenous Australians to water, and planning for a drier climate. They'll also touch on significant successes in sustainable water management, positioning Australia as a world leader in the space. The panel will be chaired by Rob Vertesi, who's down in front here. He'll come up in a minute. Rob is a climate change and water security expert and has been leading the federal government's review of the mass fish deaths in the Darling River. Rob chairs the MDBA Advisory Committee on Social, Economic, and Environmental Sciences and Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering's Water Forum. He's also the Enterprise Professor, Water, Agriculture, and Environment Program at the University of Melbourne. He's led a distinguished career in water research since graduating with a PhD from ANU in fluvial geomorphology, serving as the Bureau of Meteorology's CEO and represented Australia at the World Meteorological Organization. That was a mouthful. Our expert panelists here begin with Professor Sue Jackson. Sue is a cultural geographer and with over 20 years of experience researching the social dimensions of natural resource management. Sue is leading several projects through the Australian Research Council and the Commonwealth's National Environmental Science Program, and is co-founder of Water Futures Environmental Flows Working Group. She's a member of several state and Commonwealth technical advisory panels and affiliated with the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University and the University of Melbourne. Mike Stewartson, Professor Mike Stewartson, with over 20 years over the last 25 years, Mike's research has focused on interactions between hydrology, geomorphology, and ecology in rivers. Mike has participated in the evolution of environmental water management in Australia through many advisory roles at all levels of government. He leads the Environmental Hydrology and Water Resource Group and the Water Environment and Agricultural Program at the University of Melbourne. Mike is also the director of the newly established Mallee Regional Innovation Center. Professor Nick Bond, next to Mike. Nick is the director of the Center for Freshwater Ecosystems at La Trobe University and has more than 20 years experience working on the ecology and hydrology of rivers and streams with a focus on Australia's water-stressed regions. He has held leadership roles with several cooperative research centers, helping to establish strong links between research and industry and translating research to guide water management and policy. He currently sits on a number of scientific advisory panels for the state and Commonwealth agencies. Professor Lee Godden, next to Nick. Lee is the director, Center for Resources, Energy, and Environmental Law at the University of Melbourne. She researches in environmental resource law, natural resources law, water law, and Indigenous peoples' land and resource rights. The impact of her work extends beyond Australia with comparative research in countries as diverse as Canada, New Zealand, the UK, South Africa, and in the Pacific. Her contribution to environmental conservation and social justice has been recognized by invited membership of leading international and national environmental and natural resource organizations. Renee Woods is the last panelist at the end there. Renee is a Ngari man from southwest New South Wales in Australia. Renee has been involved with the management of Aboriginal culture, heritage, and natural resources for many years, and is currently working as an Aboriginal Heritage Conservation Officer in the NSW Office of Environment and Heritage. As chairperson of the Murray-Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations, Renee represents the Southern Murray-Darling Basin nations on the National Cultural Flows Research Project and manages the Gaini-Nimi Kaira project and manages the Gaini-Nimi Kaira project. He enjoys working with communities on the ground to promote awareness of Aboriginal culture and heritage, water issues, and getting local communities back on country and involved in water management. I would like to now welcome you all to this and hand the discussion over to Rob Vertesi, who's going to lead the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, what a wonderful turn-up. This is great. We do have a purpose. We have all come here with a purpose, and I think that's to actually throw a little bit of clarity and light on a conversation which most of Australia seem to be having at the moment about how the Murray-Darling Basin is travelling. There's been a lot in the news the last few years. We've heard about water thefts in the Northern Basin. We've heard about fish kills down in the Lower Darling. There's been a South Australian Royal Commission that's made some staggering claims about the state of affairs. And we're in the middle of another diabolical drought, of course, and that, of course, brings a focus always back to water security. So there's a lot of commentary out there. We're lucky to have a fantastic lineup of experts here to help us test the veracity of some of the stuff that's being said and to give some rich perspectives on where they think the basin is heading at the moment. It doesn't seem that long ago, really, that we came out of the millennium drought. We had a bit of a quiet period after that as rainfalls returned through that dramatic La Nina event in 2011-12. But here we are again, now down to storage levels of 30% in the Murray-Darling Basin. We've seen an ecologic shock of a pretty major proportion in the fish deaths. It's no wonder that there are quite a bit of concern being expressed out there in the media and in public fora. Be great to get your insights into some of the dimensions of that debate. And I'm going to start with you, Mike, and ask you a question about a lot of activity over the last decade, really, into money and time's been put into environmental water purchases and some major water savings infrastructure projects in the basin. And some critics argue that it's not showing any benefit. What do you make of this?
Oh, well, thanks, Rob, for the question. So let's remember that the Basin Plan is effectively, at its heart, it's about returning consumptive water use, water withdrawals, back to sustainable levels. And the reduction in water withdrawals that's required to do that under the Basin Plan is, after adjustments, is 2,150 gigalitres. I'm sorry, I'm going to come up with some numbers here. There's some technical stuff in this question. So 2,150 gigalitres per year needs to be reduced, which is about 16% of the amount that was being withdrawn prior to the Basin Plan. There's a couple of different mechanisms that are being used to recover that water. So one mechanism is, in fact, the bulk of the water is being recovered through direct purchases. So we've got a water market and the Commonwealth is buying the water back. But there's also a portion, it's about a third, which has been recovered through irrigation efficiency projects. And the question is whether that saving is illusory, because the water that's being recovered is also being lost because the leakages out the bottom end of the system, these return flows, are being reduced as a result of these efficiency projects. So the two offset each other. Now, there's been two projects to assess the effects on return flows, this sort of so-called impact offsets the recovery. And the first one actually suggests, well, they both agree that there is an impact on return flows, they're reduced, and it's uncertain. So there's agreement on that. The magnitude of the impacts are quite different in the two assessments. The first assessment, which was done by ANU academics, estimated quite a high impact on return flows. This study actually, it was a good first study, but it made some pretty bold assumptions in the analysis. It treated the whole basin as a single project and just multiplied that across the basin. The second study is much more detailed. It represents every single project, and the impacts are much smaller, reassuringly much smaller. There's still an impact, but it's a much smaller impact on that return flow. So I actually feel that the concerns have been overstated, and that in fact, although there is an impact, we don't need to be as concerned as perhaps has been indicated.
And what about that $2 billion worth of environmental water that's being actively managed now?
So this is important context. So the water that's been recovered, so this loss of return flows, that return flow is just dribbling out the bottom of the system. It's not actively managed. It just flows out as it drains. The real benefit of the Basin Plan is to protect a certain portion of water as an environmental water entitlement. And what we're seeing now is that can be actively managed. So targeting specific needs in specific places of the river using specific methods to get the best possible benefit from that water as possible. Effectively, active management turbocharges the environmental water volume. So it's really critical water. It's also protected from climate change. So as we see a decline in water availability, that portion has the same security as the irrigation entitlement. So it's a really important and increasingly so portion of the water portfolio.
Great, thanks. Nick Bond, in recent years we've seen a number of ecologic shocks in the basin. Back in the Millennium Drought, of course, it was all about the lower lakes and the withering floodplains of the Murray And more recently, you and I have been quite involved in the fish kills assessment. Some people argue that these are symptoms of collapse. Are we facing some kind of ecologic endgame in the Murray-Darling Basin?
Very good question, Rob. You mentioned the Millennium Drought and the lower lakes and the condition there. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that if you look at ecological shocks, they've been major drivers of policy reform in the basin. So I think it's fair to argue that what at the time was one of the largest freshwater algal blooms that had been seen anywhere in the world that occurred in the Darling River was a prelude to the implementation of the cap on water diversions in the basin. We saw the Millennium Drought and the condition of the lower lakes decline, and the loss of red gums along the River Murray being major drivers of the bipartisan support for water reform within the basin and the implementation of the Water Act and the Basin Plan itself. And I think, again, as you say, the recent deaths of fish in the Darling once again have shone a lot of public attention on the health of the system and generated considerable debate about how well we're tracking, as you say, in securing long-term sustainability of the system. So I guess in one sense, these major shocks have demonstrably been big drivers of policy reform in a positive way, which is a good thing. The obvious elephant in the room in terms of drivers of future shocks is climate change, and I guess we are already seeing that. And so, we know that there is now clear evidence for warming temperatures so average temperatures across the basin. We're seeing unprecedented drought conditions in the north of the basin at the moment, and obviously quite dry across large parts of the basin in the south as well. And we've seen these heat waves, again, record heat waves that have contributed to these recent fish deaths. So it's really clear that the sort of conditions and this combination, particularly I think of climate and weather intersecting to drive quite sudden events is of huge concern. And outside of the basin, there's been a recognition already in other ecosystems around Australia. So kelp forests and the barrier reef are two examples of marine systems where arguably there has been almost sort of ecosystem meltdown because of extreme temperature events driving mortality of kelp and coral reef bleaching. We've seen bushfires in the highlands of central Tasmania where we've got systems that are poorly adapted to recover from those particular combinations of climate and weather coming together. One of the remarkable things I think about freshwater ecosystems, and particularly in Australia, is their remarkable resilience. So the basin ecosystems, many of them, particularly those in the more arid parts of the basin, have adapted extremely well to a highly variable climate system. And so we do see this remarkable resilience. But that has its limits as well, that resilience. And so I think it's fair to say that if we look at the longer term projections for climate change and we look at what's happened with some of the recent weather events, I think it is safe to say that there will be parts of the basin where there will be irreversible changes occur in ecosystems. It won't be everywhere. It will perhaps, ironically, given that historically dams have been a major source of impact on our river systems, I'd actually argue it's probably those where the capacity to store water and release it in a strategic way, as Mike was referring to, are actually those that are going to be most prone to potential long-term irreversible change from climate change. And so I suppose I think there's a couple of things I'd say. One is we do really need to understand where those impacts are likely to occur. And again, it's not necessarily one-off events. It will be perhaps changes in the frequency of severe weather events or severe drought that will impact on that long-term resilience of the system. So we need to much better understand how that's going to play out spatially across the basin and affect different ecosystems. But I suppose equally I'd take from our capacity to manage water in an effective way, I think does also create in many parts of the basin an opportunity to actually help maintain that resilience in the face of climate change. So that's in some ways a water management and water policy issue. Clearly there's an overarching on that, a climate policy issue as well, as the elephant in the room.
Yeah, great, thanks. All right, I'm going to pause for a second and reach over to your megaphone. Through Slido, I exhort you to start posing a few questions, and once I've finished the warm-up lap with these guys, I'm hoping to see a long list of questions that I can relay. Oh my God, look at them all. They're coming through thick and fast. Aren't you meant to be filtering them? Fabulous. Okay, that's great. We've got no problems with questions. All right, I'm going to turn to Sue Jackson. Sue, when we talk about the basin plan, we always say that it's all about striking a balance between social, economic and environmental needs across the basin. But given that people feel so differently about these things, is this somehow an impossible task?
Well, I suppose integrating these kind of three pillars, as we've come to think of them, of development, of course, is a very difficult, very challenging prospect in any kind of resource management context, and we see it in any number of conflicts around the world when we've started to think about sustainable development over the last 3 decades or so. And it's clearly a huge task in the Murray-Darling Basin, where we've got long-standing problems that are of a century in the making, that relate to historical water use practices, ideologies of development, cultural attitudes to the environment. We've also got shifting baselines with climate change. The world's moving around us. Regional communities are more and more intensely connected into global trade cycles and financial circuits. So it is immensely complex. But I think if we look at the framing that is provided in the Basin Plan and the Water Act, it does provide us some guidance in how we think about priorities and how we think about constraints. And I don't know that thinking about balance is so helpful. I think if we look at those frameworks, they actually stress the word optimising. So to my mind, that's about effectively using water resources within our constraints. And as Mike mentioned, this framework actually expressly requires that we set environmentally sustainable limits and then manage and use those water resources to optimise economic, environmental and social outcomes. So we've got some guidance there, I think, in these frameworks, and we really need to stick to them to help us to understand these as ecological thresholds. Some lawyers that have been looking into the Basin Plan and the Water Act and interpreting through, say, the Royal Commission that you mentioned there, talk about this idea of the ecological threshold as a historic pivot, giving us this priority to hold on of setting limits and then looking for ways of optimising that are mindful of those limits. I think the framework also provides some guidance in stressing the importance of critical human needs as a water use that needs to be met. Unfortunately, I think that more attention has been given, and this is a reflection of the Act, that more attention has been given to that need, the need of, say, river towns for water for domestic purposes, and for town ovals and for community amenity. That's been more emphasis been given to that issue in the lower Darling, the Murray River system, and not in the Darling, and so that's in part why we can see some of the problems up in the Darling with those towns that are dreadfully stressed for water at this point. So we've got some guidance in the frameworks, and then I think that still leaves us with great contentious questions about how we optimise. And I think the challenge for us in the next few years is to really get more community involvement and participation in discussing environmental water requirements, environmental water management generally. It's a new area, it's a new field for Australian society, and looking for ways of understanding interdependencies between these pillars or interests, the environmental, the ecological, the economic, and seeing the fundamental dependencies, tourism, for example, being a really important sector that relies in very large part on healthy river systems, and trying to break down the kind of silos in a very competitive system that pitches them against each other.
Do you think we need to have more of a principles-based discussion that's kind of somehow divorced from the competition for access to water in the basin to get this kind of conversation right?
Yes, and it's possibly also stems from our system of governance too, that sets up agencies with particular areas or fields, domains that they're focused on. So that's part of also what makes for a very competitive environment. But we really do need to try and break down those independent ways of conceiving the values and benefits of water, and look for more relational understandings, look for more ways of valuing those interdependencies and seeing the critical role of water and healthy river systems to all social and economic life in the basin.
Right. Well, speaking of voices, Renee, Indigenous Australians have barely been involved in the conversation, really, when you think about it. And many voices are now calling for much stronger involvement of Aboriginal people. Where are we getting it right, and what can we do to kind of progress that?
The Aboriginal water sector at the moment it's the final piece of the basin plan, or the water sector as a whole. We weren't involved in being at the table when they were handing out licences and back in the early days of water management. We are now through the basin plan and having that Chapter 10 Part 14 requirements for basin states to go out and have a conversation with traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin and talk through their objectives and outcomes in water management, what they want to see, what a healthy river looks like from a traditional owner's point of view, what the rivers look like for our ancestors going back 30, 40,000 years ago. They look completely different to what our generation is seeing now. There is really good work being done by some basin states. The announcement at the end of last year for an authority member, an Indigenous authority member, is a great step forward, but I'd love to see a director of water, an Indigenous director of water within a basin state, within the state water agencies. So it's right from that on-ground deliverable of water right through to the top decision makers that Aboriginal people want to be involved. The states haven't gone out there, or the federal government haven't gone out there and had the conversation or allowed the door to be open for us to come and sit at the table. Now there are projects out there, and basin states are throwing some money behind the Aboriginal water sector to accelerate and bring forward traditional owners and build their capacity to understand a really complex system that even, I think, some water planners in basin states don't fully understand, that we've got to try and get our head around as traditional owners. There's projects such as the Nature Conservancy's Garin Steel project, which is getting traditional owners back out on country, managing land and water. It's a mini basin plan all rolled up into one project. And to be a part of that as a traditional owner from that area and being in a decision-making role where I can work with the community to deliver water across there for cultural purposes and make sure their reconnection with the lands, as our ancestors have for many years. Where we can do better is the communications from the states and the federal government, the basin authority itself, communicating out what's the buy-in for traditional owners to be involved in the water management sector. Ourselves at Mildred, we're working through that with the basin states, but the states have to have a bit of drive themselves to get out there within the community, have a cup of tea with them and listen to their objectives, which is starting. It's a slow process in some states. Victoria are well in front of the game and are now leading the Aboriginal water sector within the basin.
Fantastic. Yeah, great. Long may it continue. Lee Godden, the problems of the Murray-Darling Basin, to what extent do you think we should be blaming failed cooperative federalism on this? Do we just have a political system that is just too difficult to actually reconcile differences between upstream and downstream states?
Thanks. Yes, look, I think that's a contributor. I think we have had a history since before Federation of having very different sectoral interests between the various states and territories that comprise the Murray-Darling Basin. So it's perhaps not surprising then that we have conflict, but I would take the views that were expressed by the rest of the panel that there is a need to overcome the idea that this is simply an intractable political conflict. And I think that the Basin Plan and the Water Act were certainly an important step forward. What I do see at the moment, though, is, if you like, a rollback of the governance process in, I think, managing independently and clearly for basin outcomes. And I think that that's where we need, again, to rethink our processes of water reform. Water policy is also cultural policy, social policy. It's politics in not in a party political way, but in a way of seeking to resolve different interests. And Renee was just talking about the very important step of bringing Aboriginal people and their interests into this conversation. So I think that, yes, there is a sense in which that conflict is part of an intergovernmental system that has tensions. What I do think is that the cooperative model that we see in the Murray-Darling Basin, I think it needs to be reinvigorated with a clear sense of purpose. We need to go back to think about the principles such as ecologically sustainable development that underpins the Water Act and rethink some of those areas. Put trust back in our public institutions to manage water, and to think again that water should be managed in the public interest, because I think that that horizon has slipped from our understanding.
Great, thank you, Sue. All right, got a lot of questions from someone called Anonymous. She's been very busy. I'm going to give you a bit of practice for media next week, Nick, on the fish kills report. There's an interesting question here about the extent to which the situation in the Darling was human-induced versus part of a natural cycle.
Thanks, Rob. I might defer to the chair on that one.
No, I'm wearing a different hat.
It's a very good question. It's one that I think it's safe to say both panels spent a lot of time deliberating over. The conclusion that we came to essentially was that the dry conditions in the north of the basin were the primary determinant of lack of inflows into the Menindee Lakes over the last several years. But nonetheless, the current patterns of water use and consumptive diversions from the river, and particularly the extraction of low flows, potentially have a really big impact on the capacity of that system to recover from those sorts of events. And so the Darling is really quite an exceptional river because it's so long and it has a huge distance from where the inflows are generated, if you like, in the north, down to the Menindee Lake system. And that channel receives very little lateral input for hundreds of kilometres. And so that section of the river, the persistence of deep waterholes in that section of the river relies very much on those low flow periods. And there seems to be pretty clear evidence that those have been reduced by consumptive water use in the north. So it's a complex issue, and again, I think one of the other findings we came to was that we need much better information upon which to be able to assess that question than we currently have access to. There's just simply not enough measurement and not enough modelling of some of the key movements of water through that landscape.
Right, great, thanks. All right, well, I've got another interesting question here. I'm not quite sure who to throw it to, but I think you're going to get the short straw, Mike. And it's the extent to which the media and politicians are helping or hindering the adaptive management approach that is kind of built into the basin plan.
I have to be careful here.
It is being televised.
I think the debate this has some pretty I have to say, I was listening to some of the commentary in the media, and I think probably like a lot of people that work in this environment, there's some frustration with some statements that are being made, which are sometimes ill-informed, sometimes not really presenting a view in the right context, and it's kind of misleading. And sometimes these are people that are presenting themselves as experts, and I guess I get a bit frustrated by that, to be my frank assessment. So it's neither of the culprits that that questioner was asking about, the media or the politicians. I'm a bit frustrated about some of my colleagues and how they approach some of these issues. In terms of the media, I think the media should be interrogating this and trying to filter some of this information a bit more. You know, I guess it's the same in any area. Once you know a little bit about it, when you hear what's in the media, you just wonder where they're getting this information from. And certainly in this, I just think there's so much confusion that's generated in quick responses in the media, and having been interviewed by the media, just how little they really interrogate what you're saying. You could say just about anything. So I think the media could work harder. The politicians need to, just trying to fit this into the question. So, you know, there is a need for politicians to be front and centre, because there is ultimately they hold the can for the decisions that are being made. So, you know, I think it's important that they are at front, you know, answering some of these more difficult questions. And we are seeing some politicians doing that. I'm not saying they're not, but I think it's important we see more of it.
They shift the needle, absolutely. The leadership that they can show, yeah. Sue, I'm going to come to you with another question that's come from the floor that is kind of related, and it's very dear to my heart, in fact. And the way it's been asked here is, in the world of Twitter and post-Trump message simplification, how do you explain to regular citizens what the current problems are and how we solve them? This really hits it for me, because whenever I look into anything like the stuff we had to look at in the fish kills assessment, I'm staggered by how complicated all the arrangements are.
Yeah, I was actually just going to make that point as Mike was speaking there, that this area is so profoundly complicated, and at the same time as it gets more and more complex, as we introduce more and more new ways of thinking about how to address the problems, whether it be water trades and all of the water accounting systems that have got to address climate change or any number of developing facets, we've got pressures on media outlets to reduce employment and to reduce the skill base. There are some very knowledgeable journalists that have been following these issues. I think about some of the key people that were working on the fish kills on the Darling over the summer, and following it in great detail, and following up on analysing the Menindee Lakes operations and how the new water savings projects are going to be affected, how evaporation rates feed into all of those considerations, etc. And so we've got this, you know, horrible coincidence really, that as these matters get more and more complex, we've got less and less skills in the institutions that we need to help us to bring about public awareness and understanding, and to bring informed positions to deliberations, as well as the ballot box. And I suppose it puts more pressure on the university sector and public interest bodies, community organisations, to try to build that capacity as well. I think it's quite a serious problem for this issue and many other very complex social problems.
Right, thank you. I might turn to water markets now. Lee, a question for you that's come from the audience is really about your thoughts on speculators and investors, their participation in Australian water markets. I mean, we well understand that water markets have improved the economic efficiency of water allocation, but what about some of the other effects? You know, have they hindered or helped environmental sustainability?
Okay, thank you. I might come to that second part about speculation and so on in the context of a more general discussion of water markets. I actually think that there is a need to rethink the way in which externalities and what I might call third-party impacts, such as fish kills, such as Indigenous communities being unable, for example, to access traditional fishing, and those things are not factored into market systems very readily. And previously, a lot of the economic thinking was that markets don't do well with public goods. Somewhere along the line, we have lost some of that learning. And I think in terms of some of the ecological shocks that Nick was talking about, we need to go back and rethink about whether the emphasis on transactional efficiency and efficiency of allocation really is factoring in the cost to our society and to our environment of a market-based system. So I think there are issues around speculation. I think the water trading rules deal quite well with speculation. I think the tightness of the market governance is effective in terms of dealing with those overt difficulties that might be encountered in a market. What I don't think we're dealing well with in our governance systems are, if you like, the indirect effects, because it is not within the market rules in particular ways to capture those losses. And I think as climate change impacts more directly in many ways on these systems and of resource allocation, we're going to need to go back and rethink how we put those social costs back into our market-based systems. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Lee. Renee, I want to come back to you. You've made the point strongly earlier that Aboriginal Australians weren't around the table when the licences were being handed out. Latterly, we've come to talk quite a bit about cultural flows, and just wondering if you can walk us through what these mean to you and Aboriginal Australians, and how might we approach changing the water allocation framework to give greater regard to them?
Yeah, Aboriginal people we've been put into the environmental bucket every time we start to talk about or discuss the water management framework or the water sector. We get put into the environmental bucket because in some states we're still flora and fauna under the National Parks and Wildlife Act in New South Wales. We get put there, but cultural flows are water entitlements that are legally and beneficially owned by the traditional owners. They're of a good quality and quantity, so we work out how much water we actually need for traditional owners, or they work that out themselves. There's a tool that's been developed. It's starting to be implemented across the basin, the National Cultural Flows Research Tool, and that's a 10-step tool to help quantify an amount of water for cultural purposes. Now, the ownership of that water, where it differs from environmental water, we controlled the waters for over 60,000 years. In a blink of an eye, in 230 odd years, we own less than 1% of water within the entire basin as Aboriginal people, and the majority of that is probably in the southern basin. Land, it's less than 3%. So think about the entire basin. 3% is actually in ownership of traditional owners. Where we can improve the Aboriginal water sector at the moment, there's a couple of ways forward. Raising funds to purchase water on the water market is one option. There's work being undertaken by the Department of Ag at the moment to implement a $40 million package to purchase water for economic purposes for traditional owners within the basin. Where that sits, how that ends up being rolled out, who rolls that out is still being worked through with Mildred, NBN and other partners, delivery partners with the Department of Ag. But having a say on where water goes on your country is so powerful. I'll give you a really quick example. In the Murrumbidgee Valley, there's cultural access water, 2150 megalitres. The Nari Tribal Council accessed that water for 7 years, from 2003 to 2010, during a pretty rough time in the Murrumbidgee system. To be in control of that delivery of that water, for my auntie who rang up and made the phone call to order that water to be delivered onto her country and see the black swan return there, was so powerful. She walked around town for the next 6-8 months, proud as punch to know that she was involved in returning water back onto country to get that black swan. The work I do, I've seen what being involved in water and land management can do. I want to make sure that's across every nation across the Murray-Darling Basin and then extending on. But at the moment, we've got to rely on two options: purchase it or goodwill of basin states to change their Water Management Act. But we want to have that control of that water moving forward. We want to be the key drivers on where that water's traded within the valley as well, whether it's our water moving forward. There's a lot we can do. It's just the states and the federal government coming to the table to access the market for traditional owners. If not, we'll go out there to private entities and look for those cash injections to purchase water.
Great. While you're on a roll, a related question has come through, which is how much confidence do Aboriginal collective representative organisations place in the scientific and political systems to provide for their needs?
The Western science, we've got a whole, as I said, 60,000 years of nearly untouched traditional ecological knowledge there that hasn't played a part in water planning. To date, there's been flashes in the pan that we've incorporated two-way learning with water planners, but we need to improve in that space. Politically, no blackfellow trusts government. Doesn't matter where you are, which state. There's always a hidden agenda somewhere within policy that they think's best policy for traditional owners. But the water sector, there is a real opportunity to close the gap, as the funky term is around the federal government, is through land and water. Having traditional owners back on country, dealing with culture, values and land management activities on a daily basis, the social outcomes that you see flow through to community as well, allow them to be in control of their own destiny, not have policy set for them. And as I said, the project I work on now, that's what's happening.
Yeah, right, great. Thanks, Renee. Let's go back to science for a moment. Mike Stewardson. Got a question here from Kath. Great to name yourself, Kath. Good on you. Scientifically, do we understand all the interconnections in the Murray-Darling Basin? And without this, how can we secure it?
Thanks, Kath, for a great question. I feel like I'm on Q&A. No, so scientifically, do we understand all the interconnections in the basin? No, we don't. There are massive gaps still in our understanding of the basin, and the word connections is a great word because that's what a basin is, right? It's a series of connections from the headwaters down to the mouth, between the groundwater and the surface water, between the rivers and the floodplains, and between the people and the water they use. And we don't understand those connections. So Nick talked about the lack of information in the Darling River, this river where water takes weeks, if not a month or more, to travel from one end of the other to the other end. We don't understand the losses in that system. We don't understand movement of fish through that system. To talk about knowledge gaps is completely misleading because really it's sort of knowledge islands in amongst seas of ignorance. Now I don't want to paint a picture that we really don't know anything, and it's a complete disaster. We have made some progress. You know, there's been some great integrative work. But most of our work now, because of the way research has been fragmented down, in fact there's a diminishing pool of funding, we've crunched the numbers on this over the last few years, that it funds discipline-based research in a place, a PhD or maybe a larger project in a place, but making the linkages, the connections as the questioner asked, that's what's hard, and that's what we really need is larger systemic programs that look at interactions through the river basin, which are so critical to its health, and interactions with people.
Nick, we've had a similar conversation between us about freshwater ecology and how it was barely on the map 20 years ago before the great Peter Cullen advocated for more effort in there. And now we find it at the centre of national water policy. It's quite staggering, the progress, but surely this is still a very nascent area of science. Is this problematic that we as a society have invested so much in environmental repair and yet we know, I won't say comparatively little, but we need to learn a lot more to get it right?
Look, I think one of the things that really strikes me on a regular basis when we talk about the basin is I think we often lose sight of just what a large and diverse area it is. And so we set a pretty high bar in many respects in terms of trying to come to grips with some of these questions we're trying to answer scientifically across such a large and diverse landscape almost at the same time. Some questions need to be asked at that scale, and I'll give you a good example of just, I suppose, picking up on some of the recent learnings from science of the way that some species of fish, for example, which like golden perch, which occur right throughout the basin, but previously were managed very much on a river by river sort of basis. Some of the recent research, and it's very much using techniques that have only just recently become available to scientists to be able to gain this understanding. It's starting to reveal patterns of movement right across the basin in ways that do actually really fundamentally change the way that we might think about trying to manage water to support those species and their breeding biology and populations. So, look, I think we do actually have a good conceptual understanding in many cases. There's clearly major advances like that can come about by virtue of particularly increases in technology, and remote sensing is going to no doubt play a huge role in that respect as well. Genetics is increasingly playing a role in being able to track what's happening in terms of reproductions, patterns of reproduction and so on. There's a big gap between the conceptual understanding and being able to put numbers around things, and that's a real issue when often decisions rely on those numbers and some capacity to quantify things in a material way. So I think I think we should be proud of what we've achieved scientifically, but what's missing, I think, at the moment is that coordination around what the research agenda needs to tackle and how it can be adequately resourced, as Mike says.
Mm. And how do you think we get that when we don't have any national plan for water research, nor any funding institution for water research, and funding levels that are at kind of early 80s levels of investment by governments? Is this like a real problem or what?
Yeah, look, it's a huge problem, and I suppose just to pick up on your 80s comment, it's probably worth emphasising to the audience that that's not just a sort of a cheap shot. It really is very true that that's roughly where the current levels of funding are at. Look, I look back very fondly on the CRC program for freshwater research and water and hydrologic research. I think that there are a number of, and the CRC's cooperative research centres, these were large Commonwealth-funded institutions. They still exist in other areas of research. They provided a very good point of focus for both funding and for those from various governments, from local to federal departments, to actually, if you like, have a common contact point that helped drive that coordination. And you mentioned Peter Cullen. He led the Cooperative Research Centre for Freshwater Ecology, and it was. I think we desperately need something of that nature in water research in Australia, and particularly within the basin.
Great. All right, Sue, I want to come back to you about the national conversation. We've got a great question here from someone in the audience. Is there a true forum for irrigators, environmentalists, Indigenous representatives and towns and communities to come together in a collaborative manner? Can you conceive of such a forum? I know one doesn't exist now, but how do we bring it together?
I mean, national water reform actually, I think, constructs a role for the water plan to be such a forum, for a water planning process to do that, to bring all of the people with interests in water through representative organisations together to think through setting limits on use and then, optimising outcomes, involving stakeholders in actually deliberating and thinking about the future, what the future should look like. I've been involved in some planning processes in North Australia where I wouldn't call them, was it the word ideal? True. Yep. I think they were true in that they authentically involved the people that wanted to participate. They followed good process. They drew on local knowledge in effective and innovative ways. For example, we built a 3D groundwater model that helped irrigators and rural communities to look at their water use and to break down some of the distrust between themselves and government agencies who were telling them that the reason why the wetlands were drying up and the fires were getting worse was because people were taking out too much water for mango farming. So I think that there are models of collaboration and participation that, if set on good principles, can achieve a much higher standard of discussion and debate and deliberation. I've also been involved in processes in other parts of North Australia where Indigenous communities have taken a really big lead in setting the agenda, looking particularly at how those types of forums can best represent the many language groups in any catchment. In the Daly River, for example, 11 groups needed to be represented, so they weren't going to be satisfied by having one person on an advisory panel, for example. And so, but through a process of open-mindedness in that case with the government, it was possible to get really terrific input. So I think, I think it's possible. I think that national water reform conceives the water planning process as the unit and scale at which to do it through, or to do it through.
Great. Lee, a related question for you. This one relates to institutions. It's from Tony in the audience. And Tony says, management of the MDB is complex, but we've made it so. Can our institutions cope with this complexity? And if not, how can we simplify them?
I think complexity certainly exists in water management, but I wouldn't like to use complexity as, if you like, a let-out for effective governance. And I think we have experimented for over 25 years now with a water law reform and water policy reform process. I think we know most of the elements that go into good governance. Part of it is planning, as Sue spoke of. Part of it is good community engagement. Part of it is responsiveness. What I do think where some areas for improvement exist are particularly in what I might call institutional change, and that is an openness and a receptivity to innovation and to moving beyond existing ideas of stakeholder interests and seeing it as a conflict situation. And I think that's part of where the challenge lies for our institutions. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority gets a lot of flack, and I think it's in part because it sits across that interjurisdictional governance divide. So it has to manage across state interests, local interests, national interests. So it has a difficult task, but it also, I think, needs to have that openness to change. But in part also, I think, we need to have a political system that lets it do its job. Because in the way in which the Water Act is structured, the MDBA, for example, has a role of knowledge gathering, of doing the modelling, and of developing, for example, scenarios around water planning and so on. So it has, if you like, the technical role, but we must remember that the Water Act gives the decision-making to the political system. So if we are looking at failures in the water policy process and the water law process, remember that the decision-making actually sits, and the Water Act gives it to the political system. And so, so I would say that there are certainly ways forward and need for improvement in and not just the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. I think there is a need for us to look at all levels across the Murray-Darling Basin. We have wonderful innovation in our catchment management authorities, and those really were the prototype for the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And it's an incredible task that's being asked of the MDBA. And I can't think internationally of any other organisation that possibly has as complex a task. So, yes, room for improvement, but let's remember where the ultimate authority for decision-making sits, and that's with our political system. And we need to demand better from our political system, that it needs to rise above sectional interests in managing that complex interface.
Good-o. All right, we have 3 minutes and 3 of you will speak up and tell us what the top 3 untruths are that you want to daylight now, okay? So I'm going to let this go randomly. Whoever wants to speak, if there's a great untruth that you want to clear up, you've got a minute to clear it up.
Well, I mean, the untruth that so one untruth that seems to appear often in some areas of the media is that everything is a complete disaster. That the Murray-Darling Basin management is totally off the rails. We need to throw the whole thing out and we need to start again. I just think that's an incredibly misleading untruth. It's not off the rails. We should be really proud of where it's at. It's got some problems, and let's get those problems in perspective.
Good. Okay, that's 1. Come on, Sue, there's got to be an untruth on your mind.
That the market, we can leave the market to sort out critical issues of water distribution, and that will take the politics and the conflict out of water governance.
Nice one. Yep.
Probably one of the untruths that it's so incorrect out there that Aboriginal people have lost their connection and their understanding of the waterways. It's not lost. It's just laying dormant there within our elders. We are losing our elders, but we need to tell that story. We need the states to come and have a discussion. Water managers come, build our capacity to understand the white man's way of managing water. We know how to do it culturally. We just need to be given the space to do it. So being back on country, managing those waterways again, and it'll all come back. We never write things down. It's all been verbal. It's there. It's untouched in the water sector. We need to tap into it.
Great.
Sorry to use that pun.
I'm loving these untruths. I have to invite 2 more. Lee.
I think possibly, well, Australia has certainly been upfront in its innovation in the water sector. I think one of the true untruths is that the problems that we are facing are unique. In fact, if we look the world over, there are very similar problems being tackled in a whole range of countries. And I think we can also have some cross-learnings. And I think that's going to be a very important way forward, that we don't think we're doing all this solo. There's learnings from other countries, and we can also seek to build on our experiences for other countries.
Great, thank you.
Nick, you're the
Okay.
last.
I guess I'd like to challenge the notion that there's a lack of trust in science. I think that's often the case in the way that it's portrayed or discussed in the media, but my own experience, particularly when you're actually out talking to people on the ground, in general there's a strong thirst for knowledge and understanding. I think a number of people tonight have highlighted, other speakers have highlighted how complex the water management issues are, and the language around that also is very alienating to people who don't have a stake in the irrigation sector, frankly, or in water management. So I think there's a strong thirst for knowledge in the community.
Great, thank you. Well, I hope you agree that they have shone a bit of light on the truth in the basin and helped us all think a little bit more about the conversation that is raging. Thank you for your questions and for your participation in this event. Show them some love.
Okay, so for the speakers and the panel, or for Rob and the panel, we have a few gifts that we like to give out. And I guess it's a water-based product here. And so let's just give them a hand again. I thought it was really great. And so as I said at the outset, this is the first in a series, and the next event in the water security series will be held on the evening of Tuesday, the 7th of May, and it will focus on desalination plants and the value of water storage, implications for operational policies, so that'll be very interesting. It'll be held at Engineers Australia, and information will be sent out later regarding the details on how to register. So that should be an interesting one as well. Many of you, as you came in, you probably saw the posters in the lobby. Those were by Professor Ginny Lee and her team from Landscape Architecture. It's really interesting. These are a preview of the Water Lore Learning from the Drylands exhibition, which is opening on the 15th of April and will run through May 10th. And it'll be on campus at the Dulux Gallery in the Glyn Davis building, which is the Melbourne School of Design. Thank you all for attending, and have a great night.